I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles. We're back on the Radio American Network. Thanks for being with us. I'm honored to be joined in the studio today by retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas MacArthur, also author Douglas McGregor, known for the book Margin of Victory. He's actually a distant cousin, believe it or not. We're descended from the same bunch in the Highlands. So, Margin of Victory. We're going to delve into battles from World War I, a couple from World War II, the Israelis at the Suez in 1973, and finally, Desert Storm. Why did you decide to write this book? One of the critical lessons I took from 1991 was the immense amount of time invested in preparing the armed forces between 1975 and 1990. Across all armed forces, but especially in the United States Army. Some viewers might remember that things were not good after Vietnam. Fortunately, we had some general officers who had served in the Second World War. They set out to build a new army capable of facing the Soviet armed forces, presumed to be the most likely enemy at the time. Modernization went hand in hand with organizational restructuring and an enormous effort in training, recruiting better quality soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, and captains, and providing them with the right training and experience to be effective. That taught me something, and I decided when I wrote this book that I would explore what has happened in the last 100 years. Not because I think the previous several thousand are not important, but the 20th century is close to us, and most of what we're dealing with now is fallout from that century. Absolutely. What you find is a similar story in each case. Decisions made 10, 15, sometimes 20 years in advance influence how you fight, organize, and think about warfare, the technologies chosen, integration into the force, and finally, the quality soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, and captains, as well as the command structure. Integrating at a high level, particularly at the operational level just below the strategic, and the strategic decisions that lead to the war. National culture plays a major role in all of this. Each nation treats its military differently and approaches the challenge of preparing for war differently. You mentioned in passing the decisions made a decade or two before a battle or a war, often making a huge difference. Talk about why that seems to be a concept most of us don't think of. We often think of decisions made in the heat of battle being so critical and why it's important to understand that. Americans and, I'd say, the British are very much alike. Probably because we both speak English. We're insular powers with similar cultures and governmental structures. Shortly after the Boer War, not a resounding success for the British Army but declared a victory, there was a conclusion reached by a new liberal government in 1905 that it was time for the Army to be reformed and reorganized. They realized that they couldn't continue fighting as they had in the past. So, they brought in an attorney, a lawyer with no military experience but remarkable background and philosophy, also a Germanophile. He spoke, read, and wrote German and had studied there. He stepped in and efficiently transformed the British Army from one designed to suppress tribesmen and insurgents to a modern army ready to face potential enemies like the Russians, French, or Chinese. That army became the British Expeditionary Force, the subject of the first chapter. He built Britain's first general staff and attempted, for the first time, to integrate what the Royal Navy did with what the Army did in a coherent way. This was a successful outcome for Britain as they had a rapidly deployable force that was devastating. If that hadn't happened, the British would have had virtually nothing to send. I think we're in a similar position now as the British were. We're emerging from a period of chasing insurgents and rebels, and our forces that could fight capable enemies don't exist. They're not trained or available. We need to go through a similar process. When you look at other states mentioned here, take the Japanese, for instance. They learned from the Russo-Japanese War that they could take on and defeat a Russian opponent, but they drew many wrong lessons from it. They tended to believe they could sacrifice thousands of people, thinking it was acceptable because their people were braver than the enemy. Thus, there was a failure to consider the industrial base and the criticality of long-term modernization. This neglect came back to haunt them when they found themselves in the Second World War fighting the United States and the Soviet Union. They were simply not in a technological position to compete. On the other hand, after World War I, the Soviets were governed by Bolsheviks, committed Marxists who viewed the world almost exclusively through technological laws. They set out to build a force capable of conquering the world, essentially being at war with the world from the moment they took over in Moscow. Stalin picked this up and created the world's first war mobilization state. So, when the war began, he had reserves of material and enormous numbers of people, but the force took time to be effective. Its success also heavily depended on mistakes made by the Germans. The original German army never considered war with the world, which contrasts with other nations' decisions influenced by national cultural reasons that made sense at the time but sometimes led to later punitive consequences and defeat. Colonel, let's pause right there. We'll be right back with more insights from retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas McGregor. The book is Margin of Victory. I'm Greg Columbus, and this is Veterans Chronicles on the Radio American Network. Today, we're joined in the studio by retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas McGregor, a combat veteran of both Desert Storm and the war in Kosovo, also the author of Margin of Victory, 5 Battles That Changed the Face of Modern War. Colonel, you laid the groundwork in our previous segment, explaining why you wrote the book and the critical lessons often ignored or misunderstood by history. Let's start at the top of the list, the Battle of Mons, very early on in August 1914. It was the beginning of World War I after Archduke Ferdinand's assassination, and multiple countries entered on different sides. Germany almost wiped out the Western Front in the first few weeks. Focusing on the British Expeditionary Force, you point out in the previous segment that the title of the chapter is Mission Impossible. The British suffered losses at Mons, but their ability to retreat effectively was the takeaway due to concepts developed decades before. How did the British Expeditionary Force manage to survive and fight another day? Well, I think there are 3 key aspects. Firstly, Sir Richard Haldane was pivotal, building this force almost from scratch starting in 1905. The force was assembled in England, primarily for training. He improved educational standards, setting up educational programs in the British Army for soldiers, recognizing its importance. Then, he equipped them with new equipment, especially rifles and machine guns, which they learned to use effectively. They were ready when the battle began, their primary mission being to prevent the French from being outflanked. Not so much due to their size, but because of the Germans' inability to envelop and destroy them. The German commander of the First Army became obsessed with this small British force in front of him. They inflicted heavy casualties and evaded destruction. Instead of moving north and further west, essentially going around them, he followed them, engaging in several unnecessary battles. The British sustained losses, 15,000 in 10 days to 2 weeks, but their army held together remarkably. They managed to retreat to the Marne and hold their position. Their performance allowed the French to shift more troops to the center of the Marne, where the decisive battle against the Germans took place. Eventually, the German high command was unhinged, and the rest is history. The Schlieffen Plan, the German push through Belgium to get to Paris, was thwarted. If the British Expeditionary Force hadn't executed the retreat excellently, Paris wouldn't have survived. No, I think suggesting that the small force of at most 180,000 when fully assembled did not make a difference is wrong. It had a profound impact on the outcome of that initial campaign, leading to the stalemate we know. When discussing the stalemate of World War I, there wasn't much room for imagination after it began. Lord Kitchener called it the War of Spade and Wire. Everyone expected a war of movement, not realizing the extent of firepower's evolution preventing the maneuver they hoped for. Consequently, most focus switched to the east for the Germans, as there was more room for movement. Our timely arrival in 1917 and our significant presence in 1918 turned the tide. If we hadn't intervened, the Austrians and Germans would have prevailed in the West. As for the British Air Force's achievements compared to the lack of imagination in tactics overall, well, there was no room for much imagination once the stalemate set in. The emphasis shifted to firepower and masses of citizens sitting in trenches until one side or the other collapsed. There was no real copycatting. It was the end of a form of warfare involving highly trained regular professional troops, transitioning into an attrition exercise in firepower and masses. So, What is the transformational tactic here that makes this battle the most important? Well, the Japanese send all of their officers worldwide to the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, attempting to chart a course for the future. They came back with a conclusion: we should have a navy like the British and an army like the Germans. General Lagaki, who eventually becomes the Minister of War, does everything he can to build a German-like army in Japan. However, he loses the battle because the old guard generals insist on hundreds of thousands of men with rifles and bayonets, believing that to be the key to victory. He argues that it isn't. They need mobile armored firepower, aircraft, better artillery, and so forth. He has some modest success, which shows up at Shanghai. Without those new capabilities, tanks, aviation, and the cooperation between aviation, ground forces, and mobile artillery, you get the World War I stalemate. Shanghai starts with the Japanese largely organized for World War I against the Chinese enemy, who had just exhausted years of civil war. Of course, it was a war that really didn't need to be fought because relations between China and Japan at that point were actually very good. It was a decision taken in the heat of passion in Tokyo by the then Minister of War, resulting in disaster. Obviously, the Japanese can overpower the Chinese, but they sustain heavy casualties until they concentrate their few tanks, using them in coordination and finally breaking through the Chinese. Then, you get to Nanjing and the ensuing tragedy. The killing becomes so ferocious that it turns into a latter-day culture war, a race war between the Chinese and the Japanese. It should never have happened, but did. The great tragedy is that Matsui, the commander, was a friend of Sun Yat-sen and had been an advocate for China's liberation from Western colonial influence. Initially, most Japanese thought they were liberating not just China but the rest of Asia from Western colonial influence, but it didn't work out that way. Sadly, the Japanese never learned a great deal from this. They never learned the criticality of reducing the size of their force to extract savings for prudent investment in new capabilities. That's the real lesson. The Japanese today have learned that lesson, but it's also important for Americans to understand how terrible that experience was and how this legacy of war with Japan haunts China to the present. This war lasted for years and resulted in an occupation that the Japanese could not end because the Chinese wouldn't put an end to the war. This drained both sides, just as any occupation exhausts armies. There seemed to be no end to this war, and the Japanese threat still remains very real in Chinese minds. They tend to associate us today with that and associate us with the Royal Navy and the colonial experience with the British. Reading this, you'll gain an appreciation for the thoughts that run through Chinese minds, explaining their behavior, which is not inherently hostile towards us at all. You mentioned Germany. Let's move to the Eastern Front in the European theater for Chapter 3, the destruction of Germany's army center in 1944. Here in the West, we focus on D-Day and Patton's march across France, but in the East, the Germans are bogged down. In 1941, they tried for a quick win in the Eastern Front but didn't succeed, setting up the point you're making where Stalin played the long game and Hitler played the short game. Stalin wins. That's right. Hitler was never prepared for the long game. He always had a short-game army. Stalin, on the other hand, did what the Tsars had done historically, which is retreating to the interior, leaving Hitler with an 1,100-mile front he could not defend effectively, surrendering the initiative to the Soviets. The destruction of Army Group Center is vital because its lessons resonate to the present. In this battle, after years of practice against the Germans, the Soviets expertly integrate what we now call the striking power of air power, artillery, rockets, and missiles with an attacking ground force, heavily armored with mobile infantry. This synchronization of the two is demonstrated at a high level in the destruction of Army Group Center. At the same time, the Germans are exhausted. Hitler insisted that the attack wouldn't come where it did, sending most troops on leave. I studied German journals because I was convinced that the German generals decided Hitler was crazy. They knew the attack was coming. Hitler, however, refused to believe it, and all prudent measures were rejected. The Soviets were handed an opportunity. The Germans got everything wrong, and the largely unmotorized infantry force was smashed by this modern, highly integrated force. During the attack on Army Group Center, Marshal Zhukov simply gave an order for 5,000 fighter bombers to attack 50 encircled Germans. It happened in 15 minutes. That was the level of integration and unity of command that the Soviets achieved, unmatched before and, I'd argue, since. That unity of command was vital to victory. The Russians had large numbers of non-Russians in their force, treating them as components of their army without brooking any disputes from allies. Shut up, get in line, we're in charge. That's how the Russians and Soviets ran things, the only way to win. We didn't do that. We had another problem, the service problem. The Air Force, this is my war, my way of doing things, we can win this on our own. Impossible in the Soviet military structure. Everyone focused like a laser on the goal and contributed to the common cause. No air marshal would have said, "Stop, if you let me pick targets deeper, I'll win the battle." If he did, he'd have been shot. About 60 seconds before our next break, the toll on the Russian population from World War II is immense, varying in numbers from 25 to 30 million, likely much larger. Today, we see that Mr. Putin passed a law forbidding any public criticism regarding the conduct of the war. He closed the NKVD archives, preventing anyone from accessing them to see the truth, which is actually far worse than we ever appreciated. If you begin to look at the demographic studies done after the war by a man named Murray Fishbach, a brilliant demographer, he demonstrated that whole segments of society vanished. It was a break in generations, that's how terrible the losses were. Of course, the only way they could do this was with the NKVD, the divisions of secret police forces, paramilitary forces forcing people into action. So, a huge toll to make this strategy effective. Colonel, let's pause right there. When we come back, we'll talk about the last 2 chapters in this book and the battle lessons from them. We'll be right back. We're back with the final segment of this week's edition of Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus. Thanks for being with us. Honored to be joined in the studio today by retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas McGregor. The book is Margin of Victory, 5 Battles That Changed the Face of Modern War. As is often the case on the program, Colonel, time is getting away from us. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we have 2 chapters left. So, Chapter 4 focuses on a war that I think most Americans are aware of, but not necessarily in detail, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Israel, of course, had wiped out the threat from its neighbors 6 years earlier in 6 days, but then faced a surprise attack in 1973. What's the takeaway from that? The takeaway is that the Israelis had a national general staff that could operate on 2 fronts simultaneously and effectively defeat both opponents by allocating resources, ground forces, air forces, naval forces, as necessary in making decisions about when and where to concentrate. Another point is the high quality of the individual Israeli soldier, highly intelligent, very thoughtful, well-educated, technically competent, ready to take risks and make critical decisions on the spot that were crucial to the outcome of battles. On the Egyptian side, they had a much tougher time. Only 32% of the population was literate. To address this problem, Mr. Sadat harnessed all of the nation's university students, bringing them into critical positions in the military. The Egyptian army, as a result, fought much better than ever before and surprised the Israelis. They worked within the limitations of their potential and managed to seize control of a portion of the canal and hold on to it. Their goal was not to destroy Israel but to regain the Sinai and Egypt's national honor. They achieved that strategically, even though they were on the losing end at the end of the war. The lesson here is to look for solutions in future wars that end conflicts that both sides can live with. We talked about it earlier, but Chapter 5 focuses on Desert Storm. It was a brand new approach for the U.S. military after coming out of Vietnam, with a lot of hesitation about what could be accomplished. However, the U.S. military exceeded all expectations. What made it so successful? Decisions made in the late 60s and early 70s about equipment, technology, organization, and human capital in all services paid off handsomely. The Navy, largely built from scratch thanks to Admiral Zumwalt, and the Air Force went through a similar process. Suddenly, there was superior technology, equipment, and first-class human capital, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. All of these decisions led to something unseen since 1914 with the British Expeditionary Force. The U.S. moved hundreds of thousands of troops, equipment, ships, and aircraft thousands of miles and assembled them in the desert, then hurled them at the enemy. However, unlike the Israelis, there was no national general staff or high command, no unity of effort, and no coherent planning method. The senior generals were still traumatized from the Vietnam period and were surprised by their unit's performance, leading to a 40-day unnecessary air campaign. We did not organize ourselves to integrate capabilities as the Soviets did in the destruction of Army Group Center. If we had, that war would have been over in a few days. The lesson here is to understand your own limitations and your enemy's limitations, maximize the effectiveness of your force by integrating it, and achieve synergy.